Great, so now you've done your drawing, then we're going to move on to the painting. Before you go on to the painting, after doing any charcoal drawing on canvas paper, because you can see that it's quite a strong texture on canvas paper, you need to take a rag or a tissue and rub over the whole picture to remove any excess charcoal. Always do a little test run on the corner of your drawing to check that you've applied enough pressure of charcoal onto the canvas paper. I have seen many a student just to rub over and take off their entire drawing because they haven't pressed hard enough. Be careful about that. Then once you've done that, we're going to move on to the painting. Right, now we've got our paints ready and I'll go through the colours for you. Also got some brushes and some rags. The rags are really important to this. I am using kind of a cotton base, well it's a bed sheet that's cut up. It means that because it's a nice smooth surface material, you can rub in and be quite tough on your paint on the surface and get a better finish. Do go for a natural fibre if at all possible. Then for brushes, I've got some natural hog hair, which is very stiff and good for the initial layers of painting, and then I've got some softer synthetic hair down to a tiny little hairbrush. This is a 000 to get the veins on the detail. Remember with brushes, the head, so a flat head, chisel head, depending on what you want to call it, it's all about giving you areas of coverage, where a pointed head brush is about giving you detail and getting into the nooks and crannies of a painting. Always handy to know. Then over here on my painting side, on my palette side even, I have got ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, dioxin purple, crimson red, cadmium red, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, titanium white, which is the better white for mixing, okay? If you're doing pure white painting, then you kind of want to go probably more zinc white, but you know, it depends, it's personal taste. And then I've got some ivory black. I generally have ivory black because that's what I like working in. I like the blue and green tones that you can get from an ivory black. If you don't have an ivory black, you've got like Mars or one of the other blacks, because is it me or is there so many blacks on the market and whites on the market these days it gets very confusing. I really wouldn't worry about it for this picture. There's just a lot of purple, so it's going to be the purples that we're concentrating on. Now let's get started, shall we? Oh, I nearly forgot linseed oil. I've got some linseed oil as well. So with linseed oil I can thin out and smooth out the surface of the paint. I can also lift paint off the surface if I want to. You should never be dipping your brush directly into your linseed oil. You should always have a jam jar with a little bit on the bottom so that you don't cause cross-contamination in your entire pot of linseed oil. There's always one student out there that's doing something daft like that, so just a little bit of a warning before we get into the detail of this, and then it all goes horribly wrong for you and you upset a whole bottle of linseed oil, so that you know. Now, for something like this, it is going to be a bit messy and I probably will be getting this on my hands. Therefore, I would recommend either you could wear gloves, which I absolutely hate, it makes all your hands hot and sweaty, or you can use a barrier cream. This is my barrier cream I use, and it means it just protects your hands and you can wash the paint off easily after working in it. You just take a little bit on your finger, as so, and then you rub it over your hands and it protects them. Now, if you're working in acrylic paints, obviously your process is going to be a little bit different. Well, the technique's actually quite similar, but the process is different because you're going to be looking at mixing in your slow dry medium. Keep all your colours wet so that you can constantly work them on your surface of your paper. You should have the colours laid out on your palette. Always try and make sure that you've got a section in the middle so that you can mix your colours. There will be a degree of mixing on the surface of the canvas, but with the acrylics you do need to be adding in a slow dry medium to keep them all wet. Also, working on a stay wet palette will do that and make your life a lot easier. The longer you can keep a paint wet, the easier it is to smooth one colour into the other and make it look a lot more natural and realistic. So it depends on what type of artwork you like. If you want something realistic and smoothed out and you're working acrylics, you're going to have to add a bit of medium to get that to work. Now, first of all, let's grab a brush. I'm going to grab this brush and I'm going to have a look at my reference image. Fundamentally, I have a lot of purple on this picture. Purple and green. And some bits of yellow. Now I'm going to work on the purple, but when you're working on the purple, you're also going to probably have to work a little bit of green in just to get the tone of purple correct, because colours can look very differently once they're put next to each other on the surface of a canvas or piece of paper. You need to work it as a whole and understand what's going on and make changes as you go through the process. This means I'm going to first of all start laying in my mid-tones of lilac. So you can see I've got these lighter areas where the light is hitting the flowers. I've got these darker areas where they're in shadow. And then I've got a lot of these mid-tones, which is just a nice gentle purple. Okay, here and there, scattered gone throughout. When you're working a colour in oil paint, the general technique is that once you mix up the colour, you try and use the whole colour across the picture. So you wouldn't just paint in this petal. Put down your mid-tones, put your highlights, and put your shadows in. You'd put your mid-tones in this petal, then you put your mid-tones in this petal, mid-tones in this section, and you work throughout the picture. Once you mix a colour, you identify it as a whole, and you start seeing it as a microcosm process. So let's create a very gentle mid-tone purple. I'm going to take my dioxin, and if you wanted to and you haven't got the dioxin, use ultramarine blue and crimson red. You're going to then need to add a little bit of white into it, and then up the ultramarine blue into your mixture to give yourself a nice lilac-y shade. I'm then going to add some white, which is really gooey. It's a really gooey white. Now, once I add the white, I can start seeing the tone of the lilac a little bit clearer. And to me, this looks a little bit more towards a redder scale. It's a bit more of a plummier purple, where on here it's quite blue. If I take a little bit of my ultramarine blue and add that in, and when you're adding ultramarine, it's an incredibly strong pigment. You need to add a little bit at a time, because you can find that if you add too much, it'll start suddenly just shift and look completely wrong. Now, I'm just going to stir it in, because can you see how I had some lilac on my brush? And it went a little bit blue, and now it's gone back to a plummier shade. Then you can take your brush and you can hold it over and have a look. It still looks a little bit too strong, so I'm going to add some white. And when you add white to a colour, no matter the medium, it's called tinting, to make it lighter. Now that looks like a pretty good match. Now the trick I've got to be aware of is that I need to make this go over all the areas of mid-tone on this. Do I think that that's enough paint to do that? Absolutely not. Therefore, now I know that my recipe works. Bit of dioxin, bit of white, add in the ultramarine blue, I can make up a bigger quantity of paint. A lot of painting is about trial and error and getting used to how much paint to put on the surface and how to mix the colours. There's no short-term quick fixes, which generally humans like. The other thing you want to keep an eye on is to see how much the paint is going up my brush. I don't want it to come onto my ferrule. It's particularly bad practice to have any paint on your ferrule. So try and make sure that you're keeping the paint on the end of your brush. I've got a bit on there, and I'm going to work first of all on this top one, because I'm leaning on this, and hopefully you're not. You'd find this a lot easier if you're working at a slight angle, but I'm working flat so everything doesn't fall off my table so that the camera can see it. Then, not that, you know, I'm going to whinge about that or anything. I'm going to start putting down this mid-tone, being careful. And I'm working from the top down, stop me from leaning in it too much. I probably will lean in it because I always seem to manage to get this all over myself, even when I'm working the right way up. Once I've got that, then I'm going to put my brush down. I'm going to take a clean rag and I'm going to fold it so that my finger sticks in the end. And I'm going to smooth out that colour into the surface of the canvas. Now this thins down the paint and it'll blur the edges slightly. You have to watch for cross-contamination when you do this. When you start working on multiple colours, it's easy to get a little bit here and there. Now I'm going to take my white and I'm going to take a little bit of that lilac. I'm going to make it a little bit lighter. Start working in my highlights. Let's put in a little bit of highlight around here. And you might find that you need to take white and lighten that even more. Okay, and then you can take your rag, you can fold it up, and you can smooth in that light highlight into a darker purple. And if you find that your brush is getting overclogged, so you see how much paint I'm getting on there, you need to take off the excess paint. Or it'll be causing you cross-contamination with your colour mixing. Now you can use the rag to rub into it, or you can be using your paintbrush if you've got a nice stiff brush. Do think about the directions of your brush movement and that they're wrapping around the contours of the flower. Try and let the brush fairly dry on the surface of the canvas, and don't have huge amounts of paint on your brush. Constantly use your rag to wipe it off, and if you need to get that highlight in because you're starting to lose it, as you can see I'm doing here, grab a little bit of white and you can start mixing the highlight now on the surface. And then it's going to be about repeating that process. So you can see I'm trying not to use too many colours. If you get to this point you can end up forgetting which colours you've used where, and that's why we're using the same colours as we go around the picture. So if I go back to my highlight, can you see how that's looking darker just by putting this softer, lighter tone along the top? If you put that softer, lighter tone, throwing it towards the viewer. Now it's about then building up a few darks, because you can see I was starting to do it up there, showing you that micro area. So you're playing around with your lilacs, and you're mixing your lilacs, so you get quite nice lilac from ultramarine blue and crimson red. They'll give you quite a dark purple. But you can also mix in your blues to your dioxide, and that'll give you a dark purple too. You have to look at whether the purple needs to be towards the plummier, redder tones, or whether you want them towards the light, bluer tones, and then build them up. So you can see down here, I'm going to add in a little bit of shadow. Now I'm adding it in, and then again just rubbing that in with my cloth, just like that, so that you can get the tonal change. And just rub that in. You can see how vibrant that purple is. Probably need to tone it down with a little bit of blue. It's dark around here, don't get me wrong, so because it's dark you need to add just a little bit because the paint can go further than you anticipate, and then rub that into the surface of the canvas. Now if you're finding that it's not moving that much, what you can do is add a little bit of linseed oil, and I mean a little bit because the linseed oil will go quite far. Right, so I've poured out a little bit of linseed oil into my jam jar, dip my brush into it, and you can see that the linseed oil makes it very translucent. If you're using the acrylics, you're looking at adding in a little bit more of your flow medium, and it'll be a little bit glossy, you can see there, glossier, and you'll find that you can rub it in a bit easier. The paint will be kind of more amenable to the manipulation of smoothing over to the surface. Now if you're using water soluble oils, you will find that as soon as you add in linseed oil like I'm doing, it turns them back into traditional oils. So beware and that you're going to need some brush cleaner that's suitable for that. And don't worry if you get a little bit of a fuzzy edge along the end, really not a problem. We'll clean that up as we go along. Now, by adding linseed oil as well, you will increase the amount of time it takes to dry, and keep that in mind. It can be a double-edged sword. It can give you more time to work the painting, but then if you need the painting ready to go somewhere, you'll find it'll still be wet for quite some time. Now, if you don't want to be using the cloth like I'm doing, you can see I'm putting it on with one brush, and then I can smooth out with the other brush. It'll smooth out better if your brush is a little bit more of a kind of stiffer head brush. If you want to control it in that way, you can do as well. There's no kind of perfect rules here. It's about finding what works for you. I'm putting a little bit down with my oil mix in, and then I'm just using my other brush to smooth it out into the colour. I'm going to add a little bit more because you see it's a little bit more of a shadowy tone around here. Now, the trick with oil, as you can see here, is to try and make areas that look fuzzy. They're not crisp edged, they're much more of a fuzzy insinuation. You can put in your darker shadows and just work it out. Let the viewer mix the tones. Right, so you can see there I've got the basics of the flower down. Now I'm going to put in a little bit of the background as well. Just like I said before, you've got to tune the purple in with the green background. So let's mix up a little bit of green. I'm going to take, this is quite a natural looking green, so a good way of dealing with that is generally a cadmium yellow with an ultramarine blue. Ultramarine blue always makes the darker tones within secondary colour mixing, so the more ultramarine I add, the darker the green is going to become. You should get a really nice green. Now I'm going to add a little bit of white into that, and then I'm going to up the yellow because the blue is quite a tough colour. And then I'm going to start looking at putting in this mid-tone green in a few places, so I can see this light green coming down here. And I'm just kind of putting it around a few places to see how it looks, the purple. Give me an idea of whether I'm on track or whether my purple actually does need to be a bit darker or a bit lighter. Yeah, that purple looked pretty good. If anything, I probably look a little bit too plummy and it needs a little bit more of a bluey twang to it. I'm getting that more down here, so I'm going to increase more the blue into my lilac mix, make it nice and light, and start building up a little bit more tonal contrast. Right, so you can see here I'm working several brushes at the same time. It's quite common to have a different colour per brush. I'm applying in a brush with a little bit of darker blue to tidy up a little bit detail here and there. And to bring in a little bit more of a shadowy tonal contrast. So I can take my brush, I can add in my colour, then I've got my dry clean brush, and I just gently bleed it into the background petal, like so. And immediately that petal will look like it's looking behind the other one. So I do a little bit more, I'll make that petal a little bit more darker. And I can put in just a little bit here and just gently use that dry brush to pad it in to the soft, smooth oil tones, and gradually build it up just like that. And it's literally a game going around the surface of the paper, adding in tonal contrast. Okay, so I've got the basics down here. You see I've worked it up a little bit more. Now I'm going to start working into some like green space. Okay, and I'm going to start putting down my colours there. So I got my green from earlier. I'm going to lighten that up. And also, the green seems to be a little bit thick, so I'm going to dilute it down with a little bit of the linseed oil and just start padding that onto a few areas. Right, so I've done some of the background. I've got the base lines in, well, the base colours in for the flowers. Flowers could be worked up to a much more higher level, which I'll do as I work along. But I'm just going to put in these two parts here. So you can see I'm using a smaller brush. First of all, the yellow and the white. I'm going to put the white in, but I'm not going to put in a pure white. I'm going to just tint it with a little bit of yellow to make it creamy. If anything, you might find that you need to grab a little bit of green to make it a little bit of a greeny twang to it. And then I'm going to just start putting in roughly where that goes. And I've got this one over here. Now this one over here is a little bit more purer white. It's got to be the lights hitting it. So I'm going to plot that in around here. I think I'm going to probably have to bring the green down a little bit into it. I'm a little bit high, but at the moment it'll be fine. So once I've got that in, I'm going to grab some of my yellow, and this looks more like a cadmium yellow. I'm mixing in a little bit of that softer light tone, just to bring it down a bit. And I'm going to look at how saturated it is. Now, in the reference images, it's actually fairly strong. You could, if you want to dull it down, just add in a little bit of the complementary colour of yellow, which is purple. Depends on how bright you fancy your flower being. And just clean up a little bit of the green background around there while I've got my green pre-made. Bring that in. Just clean up around the edge of the flower section. Now really what you're getting to the stage of is bringing up a lot of the details. It's up to you on how detailed you want to take this. I'm going to keep it fairly loose because of time restrictions, but if you want to go a little bit more detailed than me, you can do. I'm going to take some of my blue, and you can see it's kind of a navy down here. So I'm going to take some of my ultramarine and I'm going to add a little bit of black into it to make a very strong dark blue. Obviously black is more dominant than the blue. You have to be very careful on how much you're applying here. I'm going to apply that down here. You can see that shadow working in the flower. And ease that out. I'm painting in the dark shade, and I'm using a clean dry brush just to smooth it out and to increase the tonal contrast wherever the shadows are on the petal, make it appear more three-dimensional. And after a bit of work, you should be getting a result that looks like this. So it's just basically going around, boosting up your darker shades, playing around with where you can see that tonal contrast. You can also introduce a little bit stronger highlight if you wanted to in the same process. So again, you can work over and you can introduce a little bit of white highlight wherever you might see it. You can see here I'm just putting a little bit on. Then if you get a clean dry brush, you can smooth it out and make it appear very natural into the artwork. The smaller the brush and the more time you do, the more time you take even, the better results will be. Just literally building up the detail. Right, so you should be getting something like that. You can see it's just basically putting in base colours of everything, then diluting your paint down with a medium, whether that's linseed oil if you're working with oil, whether you're working with something else, if acrylic, generally a fine flow medium, and then putting in some darks to build up the main shape and structure of the artwork, and then putting in some of the highlights, and you should start seeing results fairly quickly. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's really one of those projects where you need to go away and you need to practice a few times. Be prepared that it might go a little bit wrong in the earlier days. You have to get used to how thick the paint is on the surface of the paper, and ultimately you're aiming for a very thin, smooth paint without much texture to it. The smoother the paint, the easier it is to get fine detail, so do keep that in mind. I'll see you all next week. Have loads of fun, keep painting. Bye everyone.